Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Off the Shelf Festival session with Alexis Wright. My name is Deirdre Osborne. I'm a professor of literature in English and drama. And I would first of all be very honored to introduce and welcome Alexis. Alexis is a member of the Wanyi Nation in the northern area of so-called Australia, named the Gulf of Carpentaria. Her debut novel, Plains of Promise of 1997, was shortlisted for 3 major literary prizes and was followed by Carpentaria in 2006, which won the Miles Franklin Literary Award, the Victorian and Queensland Premiers Awards, and the Australian Literature Society Gold Medal, and has been translated into 6 languages. Alexis won the Stella Prize for her collective biographical work, told in first-person testimony on the life of the activist Tracker Tilmouth, titled Tracker in 2018. 2 earlier works are non-fiction, Grog War, 1997, and as editor, Take Power Like This Old Man Here, 1998, written at the invitation of Indigenous communities. 2 works are published in French, Croix en l'incroyable, 2000, and the short stories Le Pacte du Serpent, Arc-en-Ciel, 2002. Praiseworthy, from which you will read today, is winner of 2 of Australia's highest literary accolades, the Stella Prize and the Miles Franklin, as well as the Queensland Literary Award for Fiction and the James Tate Black Prize for Fiction in the UK. She's the only writer to have won both the Miles Franklin Literary Award and Stella Prize, now twice. Alexis held the Boisbouvier Chair in Australian Literature at the University of Melbourne and is the recipient of numerous honorary fellowships. Welcome, Alexis. Now, I'll just give my own sort of, I suppose, accolade as to this particularly extraordinary work that we're going to be in conversation about today and from which you will read. And I'd like to say that few books can match the imaginative scope, the scale, and the stylistic sweep of your novels. Your poetic and parodic use of language create a really exquisite brew of imagery, acerbic observations, and ecological encounters. And it's the rhythm and the pulse of your prose that we must accompany if we are to have the journey through your books. And like its predecessors, Carpentaria and the Swan Book, Praiseworthy too is an epical book, testimony to 60,000 plus years of continuous culture and survival and sustenance since the point of the British invasion and its ongoing aftershock, framed by the continued failure of settler powers in so-called Australia to unilaterally acknowledge that the continent is unceded and that Indigenous sovereignty is indisputable. So I wondered if you might, first of all, talk to us about the Wanyi people who are of your ancestral country and give readers in the UK a sense of how you've evolved your writing of place through the consciousness of country and ancestral traditions.
Thank you very much, Deirdre, for the lovely introduction. It's a pleasure to be talking to you and being part of the festival in Sheffield this year. And thank you for the organisers for inviting me and you to be part of this session. My Wanyi background is in Wanyi country. It's in the Gulf of Carpentaria. It's in the what we call the lower highlands of the Gulf of Carpentaria. It's down from the coast in northern Australia. It is country that's on both sides of the Queensland and Northern Territory border. Few hundred kilometers down from the coast, and or even less than that, I think. But we've had long struggles with our country. It was we've gone through the colonization process, the ongoing colonization of stolen lands and oppression and not being able to be on our country. People were taken away, put in missions, reserves, and it's only in recent years that we've have fought for native title rights, and when native title was recognised in the country through the Mabo High Court case. And some of our people have been able to return to country um, uh, down in Badango. It's there's uh, a community there, and uh, and we and a number of our people are living in the Gulf of Carpentaria, on places like Dumaji and other places, and our family we had to leave because we couldn't be there, and when the land was taken over by pastoralists, and they had ownership of country, stolen land, really, and some of the country, it's arid zone country. It's it's in the Northern Australia. It's quite warm, but we also have some beautiful areas. Well, I think the whole country is beautiful, really, and but we have what has been now made into a national park, but it's been given back under our control in a way. Um, but it still has to remain a national park. But it's a very special and sacred place, and that's called the Lawn Hill Budjamala, in Lawn Hills National Park, or Budjamala, and it's uh, rainbow serpent country.
Because I think you've said before about the country being an ancient library as well. You've written how it covers the continent and is kept in deep memory and cultural practices by the traditional Aboriginal landowners. And I thought, in terms of how your work is always working with the consequences of what's been trying to interrupt that, but it has been survived. How does Praiseworthy evolve out of Carpentaria and the Swan Book in becoming, I guess, stronger in its sense that this is a loop and we can't get out of this loop, and you need to be reminded of that?
Yes, I think I come from a background of working in for Aboriginal rights, Aboriginal land rights, Aboriginal self-government, sovereignty, from a very young age, and we were given a lot of responsibility by our elders, as senior people, and we learned a lot from them as well along the way. But if the younger people we might have had a little bit of education, and but we were encouraged to become more educated and to work in the area of rights for our people, and so that's what I did for a long time, and then I learned a lot along the way, and obviously, learned a lot from senior people, and by working on country, and 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 searching the world for what other Indigenous people were doing in terms of rights, and so we become very independent in our thinking, very forthright, and uh, and uh, and they picked me up from a very young age, really, uh, and took me, taken under the wings of, some of those senior people. And I'll go back further to my grandmother. From a very young age, from about 3, I used to run away from my mother and jump the front fence whenever her back was turned, and go down to my grandmother's place. And I credit my grandmother, for being able to see, learning how to see in a different way, and and from her cultural understanding, Wanya understanding, and and how she saw things, and that was carried through with the people I work with. I learned whole lot more, but very early on, where when I did start working for some of our own people, uh, they would get me to do the minutes of meetings, and their idea of doing the minutes in those days was take down every word, and because they wanted a complete record of what they said, and it's only later on that I learned, understood what they were trying to teach me was patience, and um because I expected things to, in our world, to be fixed up straight away. And why couldn't they be? Why couldn't we get some, settlements to some of the terrible things that were happening in our world? And uh, they uh, they taught me to be able to, see the big picture, and to take time, and to have patience, and to listen, and to hear, and to think. And so I credit that my consciousness, and my understanding, and my ability to work on, you know big works, like Praiseworthy. But I when I first started to write, or even thinking that I would move from the work that I was doing to do some writing, um, I searched the world for the ideas on and of what other writers were doing, to find out how I might write this country in a way that I felt, I hadn't seen in Australian literature. I also made a point, or I decided very early too that um, I didn't want to write in any kind of expectation that there was that in, uh, uh, in the way that I should write, and uh, or what Australian literature should be, or what any literature should be, and that I wasn't. I wanted to find my own way in this, and uh, and and I learned from people like Seamus Heaney, and we might talk about that later. Um,
Yes, there's a beautiful kind of cavalcade of writers from all over the world that you've described, about being your, in a way, mentors into the ways in which you have wanted to write. And yes, if you don't mind, if we interrupt that part to listen to the first reading that you're going
all
to
right.
give, that sort of sets up, I suppose, Praiseworthy, and the idea of it's composed of 10 oracles, and it is a book of reminders, and it is an enormous story, and the context surrounding it, we are never allowed to forget that as readers. So,
Hmm. All right. I'm reading from the beginning of Praiseworthy, the part that's called New Gods, and Oracle One speaks, and this is from very first chapter, beginning with story. Once upon a fine time for some people in the world, but not so plenteous nor perfect for others, there lived a cultured dreamer obsessing about the era. He was no great dreamer, no greater than the rest of his juggernauts in his heartbroken, storm country people's humanity. They knew just as much as he did about surviving on a daily basis and about how to make sacrifices of themselves and all of the cataclysmic times generated by the mangy dogs who had stolen their traditional land. These people, after generations of dealing with the land theft criminals, like many others around the world, had turned themselves not into a tangled web of despair, but into some of the best fighters of all times. They used pure guts for improving life and said they were in it for the long run. Theirs was a sovereign worldview, a view, the main view acceptable to their governing ancestors, a law grown through belief in its own endlessness. And through resetting the survival barometer from millennia a couple of hundred years ago by evolving a new gauge, something like a moth sonar, for only hearing what it wanted to hear. But to be frank, the facet worked like a shield for seeing what they wanted to see of the world, or to shut the whole thing out forever, and for deciding whether they wanted to speak at all. For sometimes this world never spoke for years. Then, when it did, spoke wreckage words like a piece of heaven, heavy with intent, firing all cylinders from the sky. So this dreamer fella really had some nerve speaking doubt stuff in the god gravitas of these clergy-oriented people, and like seeing and like acting as though he was a better type of Jesus, more Messiah than they were themselves, while preaching from the unpopular pulpit of himself out on the street corner every Sunday in front of all their self-defined denominational churches, and always, like too many times before, asking the same old question: hey, mob, what's the future going to be? What not? There was not a single soul in Praiseworthy who believed this fellow was real for asking such a ridiculous question in this day and age, and right in front of the world's greatest human survivors. Weren't they the real business people of all times? Extinctionless, tempest people from enduring 1 million storms, come from the arc of infinity, right down to the last baby. They were now forced to speak and yell that they knew a thing or two about being trodden upon and of being more on trend than the rest of humanity about how to look after the future. They could tell you themselves how they had to assert too much nervous wreck type of anger in their voices. We studied everything you needed to know about surviving from the biggest library in the world, country. You only had to take a quick look around Praiseworthy to see all the stories were about surviving. You do not need some redundant bullshit artist person continually harping on with his eternal question. You mob ever tried thinking about what the future of the place is going to look like? The world spins, he was told this fact thing, pretty much frankly, by the multitudes of insulted people. It always spins. The world is like a big spin dryer.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. What's so striking is that, like the towns in Carpentaria, Praiseworthy as a town becomes like a collective character in itself. And I wondered, when you were thinking about structuring where you were going to set your novel and who was going to be in it, if you think of these sorts of places in terms of being characters and having this sort of voice that is as strong as the voice of the characters that we then go on to meet.
Um, I think in the writing the book, and the book took a long time. I was working on it at the same time I was working on Tracker, and that's a big book in itself. But there was of yeah, a good friend of mine, Tracker Tillmouth, who an Eastern Arundel man and um, one of our finest political thinkers. He's a real he was a visionary, and that book took a long time and to do, and but I decided I needed to keep my own writing going at the same time, so Praiseworthy started. Uh, and I don't know, it's hard to describe, after such a long journey, where when a book is finished, to then go back on it all and to bring it all back. It seems when it's finished, it's finished.
Mm.
um, but Praiseworthy, it evolved as a place. It's a place that all the characters, they fit into that world. It's a world that was being developed over time and redeveloped and reimagined and imagination built on and built on and until um, uh, you bring in a whole lot of things. It's a world in itself, but it's a world that's in a way also represents the country, the Australia as a whole in a way, and or you can expand that into to it's I wanted it to be a place that could be recognized anywhere as well, even though it's got its own peculiar things happening there, and but it's um yeah, the country is as important to me as the characters in the book, and and the place, and so it is it is like a character, as you say. Mm.
And it's you describe Tracker as a storyteller, actually. I know at the end of our conversation we'll talk briefly about Tracker, but you describe his endless rolling ideas and his use of stories to transmit very complex issues. And
Mm.
this, I feel, is laced with every single sentence in many respects throughout Praiseworthy. And the idea of we enter into a journey and relinquish that reader ego that brings in with it what the novel should be. We've revolutionized that, if I may use a word like that without it sounding violent. And I thought too that reading what people are saying about the length of the book, which seems an extraordinary thing for people to notice and to fixate on when we think of Bernardine Evaristo calls the long form patriarchs of writing. And is there a sense that you tell the story until you feel it's the time to stop and to give it over now to people, to your readers?
Um, I think from the very start, before I even started writing the book, I knew this book would be a big book, in more ways than one. I wanted to try to capture the spirit of the times, and I was concerned about a number of things. I asked myself in very simple questions, really, you know, uh, questions about global warming, climate change, and what was happening to our people in a place like Praiseworthy. Um, our communities. How will they survive in in times in the future with with global warming, with hotter climate,
Mm.
um, and our ability to even be able to be on their traditional land, and through because of global warming, and uh, So, and I was thinking about people, that there's what could happen to people, and what the science was telling us about global warming,
Mm,
and also some of the consequences of that. And we're already seeing that being played out in wars that have been created. It's all about land grabbing
mm,
and destroying other people's right to be on their own land, and we know that story. We know that story well, and so I was wondering and concerned about what might it be like in the not too distant future, and to try to capture all that in a book like Praiseworthy, to try to, that spirit of times where life can be good for some but not for others. Life is more, some people's lives are more important than others,
mm,
and who makes that choice, um, and where do we fit as an Aboriginal community, a poor Aboriginal community? It's like a lot of other communities across the world, millions of people, and maybe more in the future. And how do we fit on the scale of things? So that's part of the what I was trying to capture in Praiseworthy, to capture that you know that where we've sort of sunk to as people, as not in general, humanity in general,
mm,
and our inability to control anything, to make it better, and and to see things happening that is just not good, even while we've got uh uh you know, quite horrific climate change um, events happening, unprecedented, climate events like floods, major floods, and storms, and um, mega fires, fires that burn for months that you can't put out, bushfires that we
mm.
see here in this country, and you see it in other parts of the world too. And so um, I wanted to try and capture those things in Praiseworthy by looking at um, uh, how people are living, and how in terms of this community, how do they maintain their own sense of who they are, their sovereignty, and I was questioning that too. We say we have Aboriginal sovereignty, but what does that mean when everything's going against it? How far do you take? How far can you continue taking that fight when it's such a struggle?
Mm.
And I was looking at those things.
Um, and also, I think you keep in the forefront of consciousness what happened in 2007 with the state terrorism, really, of what they call the emergency intervention. This is
Mm,
your second novel that directly, um, I suppose, represents what that means, because, like the 3 billion animals that were murdered by the bushfires, that
mm,
you've recognized very publicly, saying that these are our relatives, we should mourn them. You are reminding us as readers, or people who don't even know what happened in 2007, that this is an ongoing thing. It wasn't just a flashpoint event. And I thought the way in which you use throughout Praiseworthy that constant sort of contouring of a lot of the events that happen is so powerful. And also, it is a kind of ongoing um, linking of what happened from 1788 to now. And I thought, do you think, given that so many of the assumptions that have shaped the nation, the settler nation, since 1788, um, continue, that is there a sense of what they used to call reconciliation? I think there should now be another word possible when such actions that you depict in Praiseworthy and your other work are still possible.
Yeah, this is what I try to examine that in the book. I also try it. I think Praiseworthy is where I've come to in terms of being a writer from where I set out, and I've been working at it for a long time, and so it's probably where where I've reached, and in terms of trying to write a story about this country and how it's interlinked and interrelated with the world, and we see that more clearly now in these days of global warming, that how interrelated we are, and how independent we are of each other and of the world. We all live on the same planet, and uh, and uh, what happens to all of us. So that's how closely connected we are. We never didn't used to think about that too much in the past, and so um, there that. There are some of the issues that I was trying to work with in Praiseworthy, and also tried to in it's not from 70, our history didn't start at 17, 1770,
Yeah.
when Captain Cook first arrived here. Yeah, we come from a culture that's 60,000, 80,000 years old. We're the oldest living culture in the world. We've been here for millennia. When I talk about people in the Gulf, they've been there for thousands of years on the same piece of country, and that's the same all over Australia, and the whole country is interlinked with long sagas, law stories. They're big sagas of stories that interlink and crisscrossing all over the country. That's the law of this country, and um, so and that's what I try to do in my books is to bring out that um, um, that at all times that we're all we're um, well, I learned that from Carlos Fuentes, all times in Mexico are important and no time has ever been resolved. That's exactly what it is here. It's not from 1788, it's all times, and from ancient past to what's happening in colonial history, uh, and right now, and the future. It's all interlinked, and it's all important. And so I try to bring that into the book, into as I tell as I write it, that the culture is important. It comes from this long, this long time that we've been here.
And when you mentioned the ideas behind it with naming your characters as well. So the tragedy of Aboriginal sovereignty, for example, the child of Cawsman, Steele and Dance. And I wondered in terms of the way in which when you mentioned law, sort of Indigenous law, then gets crushed by the law LAW very much in the figure of this character. And how he and his brother represent the kind of ways in which this psychosis of whiteness and political power are working to constantly prevent the harmony of that 60,000 years plus culture. And so in thinking about that family, because it's really the only family that we travel through the book with, although there are sort of myriad other magnificent connections with people and land and the cosmos and so on. were those two sons, did they start off as something within which you thought, I'm going to send a message through them, and then it got filled with other, I suppose, resonances? They became symbolic as well as the human characters. I just wondered about those two boys.
Mhm. Well, the father, Widespread, Cosman Steele, what or call Widespread or Planet, his eldest son, he gives him the name. His name is Aboriginal Sovereignty. He gave him that name when he was born, so that he'll always remember who he is. And so I don't know where that character came from originally, but it's hard to go back, and this book has taken a long time to write, or a long time to work through many questions and arguments I had with myself, and on how to write it, and the issues in it, and so you get a character like Aboriginal sovereignty, and I wanted to make that connection somewhere, that um, you know what we're doing, as people, what's happening to us, the pressures that we're under, to assimilate and to give up Aboriginal culture altogether, and um, what would happen, so this young boy, he grows up, he's the apple of the eye, he's the hope of the future, and he's brilliant in every way, but he tries to commit suicide, and mostly from the doing of his younger brother, Tommy Hawk, and and then there's a search for him. He goes missing at sea. He walks out to the sea to commit suicide, and there's a number of children's suicides in this book, and this is something that does happen here in reality, um, and um, and the community, um, they search for him, and they scan the coast, they scan the sea, and they search. And in the search, it brings up their own thoughts about the meaning of Aboriginal sovereignty. What would it mean to lose yet Aboriginal sovereignty? And as the boy, Aboriginal sovereignty, and as the actual belief that we do have sovereignty. And while we're trying to battle on so many fronts to preserve that belief in ourselves and our culture. So that's, it brings up all those questions, and that um, became the idea about Aboriginal sovereignty in the book, and an idea that I had right at the start about what does it mean to lose your Aboriginal sovereignty, and how are we faring at the moment in actually trying to maintain that belief in ourselves, and given that we're under so much things happening around us, and how would we work with that idea of who we are in the future, as the world becomes warmer through man-made and unabated man-made global warming, and the ways that we see our governments respond to that need, that absolute urgent need to do something, and to stop this harm from happening to so many people. So that's Aboriginal sovereignty, and Tommy Hawk is another kettle of fish, and he's the younger brother. He's only 8, and he's very impressionable, and he's he wants to when the intervention policies were rolled out, the emergency intervention under the very conservative Australian government at the time, it was done in such a way to change the national narrative about reconciliation, that nice feel good idea of reconciliation and doing things better for Aboriginal people. That was to be gotten away with, to bring in this narrative that Aboriginal people should assimilate. That's never really gone away here, and that should assimilate and forget Aboriginal culture, forget about land rights and stopping land from being developed, being freely available for development, for mining and destruction and total use of resources. So when it was rolled out, Aboriginal people were made to. It came from a report. Little children were sacred, and the government used that report to denegate the Aboriginal world with the idea that Aboriginal people don't love their children the same way that white people love their children, and that Aboriginal children were in harm of being, there was the communities were run by pedophiles, which wasn't found to be true, and they sent in the army to examine children in remote Aboriginal communities. They took away the kind of the little control or not control but authority, the Aboriginal authority from that comes from Aboriginal law, and through Aboriginal managing their own community, Aboriginal control of managing their own communities. Not that they had much control anyway, and so it took away a lot of respect of Aboriginal people, and also of Aboriginal, authority of parents, of communities, and children. And I thought, what happens when our children hear this? It was all over the media that Aboriginal parents don't love their children, and and they're children were in danger on their own communities. So I thought, and it was freely available. People, it was really vile. It was really it went on and on, and it was done in a really forceful way. This narrative of pushing that government line of
It's like propaganda.
sensitizing it. Yes, yes. Oh, sensitizing it. That made good media, I suppose, and that Aboriginal people didn't love their children, and et cetera, et cetera. And so I thought, well, what about our kids? They hear all this too, and everyone felt like they could get on the bandwagon and just say whatever they liked about Aboriginal people, and it usually was quite, and yeah, a lot of people who didn't even know an Aboriginal person,
Yes.
let alone what happened on an Aboriginal community. And so, and if an Aboriginal and Aboriginal voices were really silenced during that period, if you didn't agree with that government line. And so anyway, I thought, well, our children hear this. What could happen to our, children hearing that, oh, my parents don't love me, coming from the government, coming from the media, and so we got a character like Tommy Hawk, and who believes all this propaganda, and he listens to it. He becomes obsessed with it,
Mm.
and he's so and he he very easily dob his parents in to the police as pedophiles or
Mm.
that he's likely to be harmed.
Mm.
And he wants his plan is to be adopted by the Australian government, to live in Parliament House, a big palace in Parliament House,
Mm.
of Parliament House in Canberra, where he thinks he can be brought up as a like a rich white kid,
Mm.
loved by white people.
Mm.
And uh, so he is uh, his father called him a in his father had called him a fascist from the day he was born. And
Mm.
but it's not very kind. But uh, it's a hard place. Praiseworthy is a hard place.
Yes.
And it's a hard place because it's been made hard, and
Yes.
over decades,
Mm.
a
And
bad policy.
I wondered if you might like to read for your second and final reading as
Sure.
we come to the end of our conversation, a section of the book, if it's possible to extract, that you enjoyed or felt something special, perhaps about writing it.
Um, and Deidre, I picked out a little bit about the haze that
Oh, great.
settles over praiseworthy.
Yes, because
In
that's the character in
Mhm.
itself. I mean, it's
Yes, it's a
salty at one
character in
point.
itself.
It's
Yes.
oh, that's
All right.
marvelous. Marvelous.
Okay. The story goes, Hate Place was a monument of the moment for some of the poorest people on earth, a hard bit of magic grown from a corpus of ancient stories that had been that had been shattered into mystery by broken spirits creating hellfires. All those endlessly wandering fragments of ancient words were coming together and forming the lines of stories entombed in smoke clouds circumnavigating the planet. Now, a windstorm from out of nowhere came more frequently, came to this place, blowing dry leaves, burnt leaves, ash leaves, and spoke of the tragedies in the epical pyres of life. The wind looked at the remains of life in this place, then blew and blew these fragments away in mountainous serpentine waves that hit the soul world of an even greater local spirit, and there, dust, ash, memories written on broken butterfly wings with black soot, all backed up into an ochre-coloured haze that ended up sitting permanently over the flatlands of the blessed be thou and the more blessed be I. This old grief haze cut a powerful image from 40,000 feet up in the sky, where ancestral serpents roamed, through the remembrance of migrating angels, and you, looking down from the window seat up front of a Q-Wave Qantas flight, so, cruising over the northern flat country, would see the grand improbabilities. Yes, the supercell anomaly was a miracle on Earth, but not a good one. Sometimes the haze floated, uh, rested on dust coated leaves, and on the rooftops, on every space, house, person, on the dog fur, bird feathers, or else. The thing charged up its weather system into an atmospheric mess of dry electrical storms, full of dust, junda, junda, junda. From the sky, you could look down to see the supercell rotating from where it sat permanently over Praiseworthy, lingering with its belly hovering just centimeters above the ground, as though it was resting on a head full of swift dit imaginings. The gravitational force of the slow moving cloud of haze pushed by the great ancestral government and held together as though magnetized, hanging like a shadow that made the place permanently looking sepia like supper time. This was how the dust storm lingered for far too many years and became a stationary presence, pivoting over the spinifex land of the Zykas, where those strugglers of apocalyptic times, the traditional landowners in this isolated place of flatlands, were continuing their long line of imaginings into infinity. Yes, these people might have looked like they were raised to the ground people, yet why would they give up easily? Millennia of their ancestors never did, simply because they not only had the will to live, but desired survival over extinction. And now they were ready and able to gamble any wishful thinking for ridding themselves of the haze, scourging the skin, and from touching the skin of their land.
Oh,
That's it.
thank you. I must admit,
Thank you.
personally, I had that passage circled. So, yes, I think, the consequences, the ongoing testimony to survival and the magnificence of that in the face of what you are constantly bringing to the foreground and praiseworthy is phenomenal. And as many people with the critical reception of this work have testified to. And I just wondered, in thinking about the last sort of idea that we had to think about Tracker Tilmuth's legacy, which accompanies you as you're writing this book. Your question in your introduction to that is, how do you tell an impossible story, one that is almost too big to contain in a single book? And I thought, have you thought about that question again now that you've written Praiseworthy?
Well, I look at Praiseworthy and now that it's published, and I don't even believe that I wrote it, and and it just I just feel it's just unbelievable, really, and but it's a work that it's just come over a long period of time, and a lot of work, and a lot of thinking, a lot of imagining, and building imagination. And we haven't even talked about the donkeys. And
No, I
no,
know.
and but anyway, read the book if you can, if you want to, and I hope you enjoy it. And it's a lot of fun. I did have a lot of fun writing it. At, I felt that Praiseworthy had to be written on a different key, on an Aboriginal chord, and that is it's a and I thought about this about how to do this, up in the Gulf, in all our interlinked tribal Aboriginal nations, we say we're of one heartbeat. That keeps us together. We're of one heartbeat, and I wondered what does that heartbeat sound like, and and so I thought it sounded like the Yidaki plane, the didgeridoo. It's that droning sound. It's a sound of country. It's a slow sound. It's a slow pulse, and a repetitive thing. It goes on and on, but that's the sound of country. That's the sound of life. That's we that's how we live, and it's also it's not just Yidaki. I thought it was the sound of clapsticks, in ceremony, and and also or women in ceremony singing. And that it's that rhythmic sound, and this is the sound I tried to capture in the book, and I worked really hard on this, and my publisher was waiting for this book for 2 years longer than what it should have been. And but I wanted to work on it and made sure that every page stood up in this way, that that had that rhythm, the necessary rhythm that I wanted the book to have.
Mm. And thank you so much, Alexis, for
Mhm.
speaking about your work and also the 60,000 plus years of continuous culture that
Mhm.
is so important for the world, really. So,
Well, we're not going anywhere.
no, thank
All
you.
right. Thank you. All
Thank
right. Thanks
you.
to Deirdre. Thanks for everything. And I hope everybody has a good festival. Bye
Yes.
bye.